The William Kilbourn Memorial Lecture and Heritage Toronto Awards Evening is an opportunity to celebrate the individuals and organizations that have worked to enrich the streetscapes, neighborhoods, and culture of our city with exceptional results. Tonight's lecture is named in memory of one such Torontonian, William Kilbourn, or Bill to those who knew him. William was a rare combination of Ivy League scholar, social activist, politician, and historian. Most of all, he was deeply committed to his city. He was born here in 1926, and he later taught here. He also served as alderman on Toronto City Council from 1970 to 1976, and he served on Metro Council as well. William Kilbourn had an unwavering dedication to Toronto's cultural life, including its arts and community service agencies. The Word on the Street annual book fair, which was just held a couple of weeks ago, was just one of his many initiatives that continues to inspire and educate Torontonians about their city and each other. The William Kilbourn Memorial Lecture was launched in 1996 to pay tribute to this man's legacy and his tireless dedication to this city, and as an ongoing commitment to his idea of Toronto as a viable, livable city that honors its past and plans for the future. We'd like to acknowledge a number of Kilbourn family members who have joined us this evening. It's nice to see so many of you here tonight. Please welcome Rosemary Kilbourn, Elizabeth Kilbourn, Pippa Kilbourn, and Kenneth Metelli. If you just want to stand or wave so we know where you are. Nice to see you here. Thank you for coming. And I'm very happy to ask Rosemary Kilbourn, William's sister, to come to the podium, and she will introduce this year's William Kilbourn Memorial Lecturer, Chief Bryan LaForme. Rosemary?
Thank you. It has been long overdue that we who live and thrive on the land of this city should acknowledge and properly honor those whose home it was for countless centuries. Our history is made of many myths. One of the most convenient is to believe that it was not a great injustice to take complete control of a land of whose inhabitants did not believe in ownership, but were generously willing to allow us to share in its stewardship, a sacred trust for the benefit of us all. So there was no payment in the first treaty of 1787, but in 1805 the British made a revision with the payment of 10 shillings because they wanted more land. The Mississaugas have waited more than 200 years for the finish of that transaction, and now with a great chief to push it forward, it was done in 2010. While it is in no way an adequate recompense for what was lost, it comes at a time to help many needs. Chief Bryan LaForme has lived a life full of accomplishment and dedication. Most people who need to escape a dysfunctional home at the age of 17 do not have such a history. But the route he chose at that age was practical and disciplined. He joined the U.S. Army in the Airborne Division. After basic training, he was sent to Europe, where he learned how to repair and maintain the complicated equipment of tanks, and had the responsibility to keep each base ready for instant action, while keeping up his credentials for jumping out of planes. As a 22-year-old veteran, he returned home ready to take on a variety of jobs, from a high steel worker to being a counselor in a reform school for the Ontario government. And during those 10 years, he became a probation officer to help these young offenders back into a productive life. In his own community, at age 34, he was elected band counselor for 3 consecutive terms, working on many boards and committees. While on the board of Mohawk College, he was able to negotiate the first satellite campus on a reserve, the same time being instrumental for building the council's recreational complex and administrative building. During this time, he also managed to earn a 3-year degree at Laurentian College, and so was well qualified to concentrate his vision and energies as Director of Education for his community. In 2001, he was elected chief, and in that role has benefited other First Nation communities as well as his own. For instance, he took on the federal government on the issue of the combined sales tax, and with persistent hard work, won freedom from it for all First Nations people across the country on or off a reserve, a help to those who are owed so much more. With all this accomplishment, his greatest good fortune, he would agree, is a very happy life with his wonderful wife, Ricarda, and their 3 remarkable and successful children. We are privileged to hear more of the contributions the Mississauga have made to this country and city from a leader who was a great example for everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome Chief Bryan LaForme.
Wow. You know, when you stop and think about your accomplishments as an individual, you don't realize what you've accumulated over the years as far as accomplishments, and that was just an example, and I really appreciate those very kind words that maybe set the stage for tonight's opening remarks, and I want to thank you very much for that. I also want to thank Gary Sue for his opening prayer. For us, it's part of our culture to do this because it sets us in the right frame of mind, and it opens our hearts and gives us the words that we need to say. But I especially appreciate it because it's done in our own language. And 20 years ago in our community, our language was lost. And many of you know the reasons why, and that was through residential schools. But I'm not going to be talking about that tonight. I just wanted to recognize the fact that we are reviving our languages in our community, and I want to thank Gary for opening in our language, especially here in our traditional territory. So I want to thank you for that. It's an honor to address you this evening in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, First Nation. Indeed, Toronto is a layered city, and one of the layers that I would like to share with you is the First Nation layer from the historical First Nation perspective, and more specifically from the Mississaugas of the New Credit perspective. In this year of 1812 commemoration, I believe this to be especially appropriate. I also believe that if you are to understand what I share, you must know that our First Nation ancestors were neither British nor American loyalists. Finally, it is important to note that my people have survived for thousands of years on this continent and will continue to do so as a people. First Nations who fought as allies of the British in the War of 1812 chose what they believed at the time to be in the best interest of their respective nations. Long before the Vikings, Dutch, English, or French were even aware that there were North American shores to be landed upon, we, the First Nations, had already been established as nations. Nations with our own languages, land base, systems of government, spiritual beliefs, and culture. We coexisted for thousands of years on Turtle Island. We had a long-established system and centers of trade. We socialized, we hunted, we gathered, we fished and cultivated. And from time to time, no different than other nations, such as the French and the British, we warred with each other. In times of conflict, we sometimes had other First Nations as allies, and to end such conflicts, we sometimes made agreements or treaties to settle these differences or create new alliances. For example, of such an alliance among my people is the Three Fires Confederacy, formed in 796 at Michilimackinac, which is a little better than 1,000 years would be the battle site of the War of 1812. The Confederacy, which was comprised of my Ojibwe ancestors, the Odawa and the Potawatomi, was formed for the mutual benefit of our nations in political matters and those of war. First Nations who became allies with the British in the War of 1812 lived on both sides of what is now the Canadian-American borders and traveled freely back and forth. Conflict with the British, French, and Americans had gone on long before War of 1812, as had alliances between First Nations and the newcomers. First Nation leaders are very aware, as many of you are, of the 1763 Royal Proclamation. The proclamation came at the end of the 7-Year Wars, or the French and Indian Wars. At that time, Britain and France had been warring for supremacy in North America, and each sought allies, various First Nations. The First Nations caught in the middle of such conflicts owed a duty to their people and nations and allied with whoever at the time they viewed to be in their nation's best interest. The Three Fires Confederacy, whose members nations at that time inhabited the present Sault Ste. Marie area, the shores of Lake Michigan, and the present states of North Indiana, Southwest Michigan, and Southern Ontario, interesting enough, had fought against the British and the Iroquois Confederacy. The Royal Proclamation was the British Crown's way of formally staking claim to North America after the war and to stabilize relationships with First Nations. At that time, it was critical to foster positive relationships with First Nations, as not only were we needed as allies, but we were needed as partners. The proclamation recognized that Aboriginal title existed and continued to exist, and further that all land was First Nations land until ceded by a treaty, and that only the Crown could buy land from a First Nation. Many First Nation leaders referenced the Royal Proclamation to demonstrate that the Crown did recognize our ancestors as sovereign nations with our own land base, languages, spiritual beliefs, and culture. Looking back as a First Nation person, it appears contradictory that while the Crown recognized Aboriginal title, it did not consult with First Nations who occupied these lands and whose lands it was on that creation of this significant document. However, the Crown believed that it was their God-given right to make such proclamations. That is, back in the 15th century, the Pope decreed that through a doctrine of discovery, that Christian explorers were to claim lands they discovered not inhabited by Christians for their Christian monarchs. Thus, the framework for relationship between the Crown and First Nation in what is now Canada was formally established. A scant 20 years after the Royal Proclamation, the 1783 treaty concluded the American Revolution, and Britain ceded all lands west of Ohio to the Americans. These lands, which are now the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, were of particular importance. One reason being that the Crown had a long-standing goal of creating a large neutral Indian state in this area. And more importantly, this area was part of the homelands of many of the Three Fires Confederacy. It isn't difficult to see why the British would want to create this neutral Indian state, as it would act as a buffer against the Americans. As you can imagine, this act was seen as a huge betrayal by the British to the First Nations in that area. This act only served to make First Nations and their leaders, such as Tecumseh, the visionary, all the more determined to fight for their land. Undaunted, Tecumseh continued his efforts and successfully united many First Nations in this effort to stop further expansion by the Americans. In June 1812, the Americans declared war on what is now Canada for a number of reasons, which included trade restrictions, the pressing of U.S. soldiers into the British Navy, the perceived support of First Nations obstructing American expansion, and possibly to annex Canada. Securing First Nations as allies in this ensuing war had never been so important, given the British attention was focused on the Napoleonic War. Had you been a leader in the Three Fires Confederacy, I ask what you would have done. Remain neutral, as you were already battling the Americans from pressing further into your territory? Or ally with the British, who had 30 years earlier ceded this very territory to the Americans? As we all know, the decision was to ally Britain. And had it not been that choice, we could very well have been one of the stripes on the red, white, and blue. The War of 1812 was a changing of the tides for First Nations, as it would be the last time our participation would not only be important, but absolutely critical to the outcome, and the last time we would be viewed as allies. First Nation allies fought successfully in major battles from Michilimackinac on the western shores of Lake Huron all the way to Detroit. As well, our ancestors and many of your ancestors fought in this very area of what is now Toronto to defend Fort York against the Americans. The loss of this battle and the burning of the Parliament buildings were seized as a psychological advantage by the Americans, as York was the capital of Upper Canada. However, had they stuck to Plan A and concentrated their forces on Kingston and had been successful, that would have been a much more strategic military victory. It seems that although the war has been largely viewed as a stalemate for Upper Canada, Britain, and the Americans, the outcome after the war was a success for those parties. The British had been able to, with the help of First Nations allies, keep the Americans out, and the Americans were able to reestablish trade with Britain and to continue to expand into First Nations territory. It is generally acknowledged that the losers in the War of 1812 were the First Nation allies. By the end of the War of 1812, not only had our numbers been further diminished, but we became vastly outnumbered. Due to the influx of immigrants, Empire Loyalists from America, and almost all of the Six Nations Confederacy, we were also British allies during the war, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit found it necessary to find a new home. That is, what yesterday had been our home along the banks of the Credit River had given way to cleared lands for farmlands and fields and villages and towns. For almost 7 years, we searched for new lands. But in May of 1847, my people moved to our present location, where we continue to live today. As I noted earlier, I felt it most appropriate to share with you our history as it relates to the War of 1812. Given this year's theme is a layered city, I would be equally remiss not to share with you the Toronto Purchase Agreement, and I'll give you the short version. Registered as Crown Treaty Number 13, the original agreement was signed in 1787 and amended in 1805. The area in question is the present-day Toronto, the southern boundary being Lake Ontario, the western boundary being Etobicoke Creek and Highway 27, the northern boundary being south of Side Road 15, Bloomington Road, and Asperger's Bay along the 404 to the east. Decades of research, countless meetings, frustrating negotiations, and community meetings finally ended in a majority vote in May 2010 by our members to accept a federal offer. The federal offer of $145 million represented the difference, what had been paid for the land and what should have been paid for the land back then, expressed in today's dollars. We set aside $14 million for community development and infrastructure, education, and land acquisition. The balance of these funds have been placed in a corporate trust to benefit our community and its members for many years to come. In summary, looking back, although things aren't certainly what our ancestors dreamt they might have been, had we never extended a hand to welcome the Dutch, French, English, who found their way to our shores, the fact of the matter is that it did happen. I believe that we made the right choice to ally with the Crown rather than remain neutral or ally with the Americans. After all, it was the British Royal Proclamation that led to the foundation of the recognition of the Aboriginal rights to become enshrined in the Canada Act, and required Canada, on behalf of the Crown, to recognize our treaty. Somewhat reluctantly, I might add, but recognition nonetheless. And most importantly, we, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, continue to exist as a people within the country of Canada. Thank you all very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief LaForme. That was fascinating. It was fascinating and very insightful about the War of 1812. It gives us a whole new perspective on that. So thank you very much. Let's have another round of applause for Chief Bryan LaForme. And Chief LaForme, if you don't mind, I'd like to call you back to the stage because Patrick Forster, who is chair of Heritage Toronto's programming committee, would like to say a few words as well.
Chief LaForme, on behalf of Heritage Toronto and all of us here this evening, let me offer our sincere thanks for being our distinguished William Kilbourn Memorial Lecturer. It is a true honour to have you, the Chief of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, share the perspective of your community in the history and continuing development of our city. It has been a privilege to hear about the relationship between the Mississaugas and Toronto. Please accept this small token of appreciation from Heritage Toronto. Thank you again.